just a little bit more clarity about the elements slash aspects slash characteristics um, that we look for when we're looking at genres and kind of the similarities that you're going to look for while at the same time writing down specifics about the movie that you see. If you look at this genre moving watching form and at the last one where I'm asking you to sort of summarize or define the genre characteristics, uh, that is relating then to this little guide. How is there a pattern within those characteristics? And then how do your individual films either kind of fulfill that or partly fulfill it or whatever? Okay, the reason that we have genres is basically because there is a grouping of films that have things in common, right? And then if they have enough things in common or that pattern is established enough, we often give that a name. And that is where genres come from. We actually create genres. It's not as if there's a god of genres who says, I proclaim that this genre now exists. Okay, the similarities often show up in these different places that are on the little graphy things. I'm going to walk through a couple of items. Sorry about the dog in the background. I'm going to walk through the places where you see that. Okay. Often there will be similarities in setting. Remember that similarities in setting are time and place. If we talk about space fantasy films, for instance, people forget about the time, but often the time is sometime in the future because we're looking to see ourselves and our advancements. Few of them, like the Star Wars, are a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But I would say that's kind of the rarity. It's more often that we're looking ahead into the future and see this neat thing ourselves. But other settings that often show up are the interiors of spaceships, planetary surfaces. Sometimes we see like Earth is the place where they were leaving to go from, and whatnot. So looking for what are the patterns of the places that showed up in the films that you watch. Now, characters, obviously films have characters. We're looking for similarities and patterns within the characters. So if it's a heavily defined genre, and if you watch the other screencast, or if you're about to, there's a part where we talk about classic, and then once things become really formulaic and really following the same pattern in a genre, sometimes you end up with more and more and more stereotypical characters. In general, though, there are enough characters and character types that are related to each other that we can come up with a genre. Okay, I'm rambling. Let's say we're talking about our space fantasy, right? Except for kind of the updated in the future state space fantasies. Space fantasy. If there's an astronaut crew, there's probably somebody who's willing to take risks. And then there's another main character that is sort of our protagonist. And often there's a love interest for our protagonist that may or may not kind of come to fruition, but we think probably secretly they will. There is a hostile alien counterpart. There might even be an alien counterpart who's trying to make friends, but is doomed. Now I'm going off into different things. But what characters do we usually see? Is there a silent stranger? Is there the scientist who never gets listened to? Probably, because they always like to throw those guys in theirs. Okay, plot. Again, we're looking for the patterns within the plot / the interesting deviations from the plot patterns. One of the things is looking at how, looking at the different types of plot in terms of where our conflict lies. Is this two people kind of duking it out? Is this a person with their own internal struggle? Is this one person against a group, whoever that group may be? Is it human against nature? any of those, like the world is falling apart kind, or any of the Jurassic Worlds, Jurassic Parks, those are obviously human versus some sort of nature. And then when I say supernatural, human versus supernatural, a lot of that, it can be the paranormal stuff, but it can also be something just outside of the realm of our natural thing. So supernatural could be ghosts, supernatural could be aliens, supernatural, just something dealing with the warped time, reality, etc., whatever that is. And you could throw a bunch of more super special guys in there, but it boils down to those little guys. But besides just being that central conflict, it's also, is there a pattern of events? How many romantic comedies are like, hey, person sees another person, there is sort of an attraction at first sight, and then they work towards something, and then, oh no, there's something that splits them apart, and then they have to find their way back together, and then, yay, it's a happy ending. And generally they end with some sort of wedding. Very rare for a film to go any further beyond that. In terms of love comedy, love, whatever, the romance, they usually do end with some sort of permanent getting together, so we know that everything's going to be okay and we can leave their story to somebody else. Westerns are really fun because the typical old school Westerns, maybe if a stranger comes to town and then is there to like unpack a mystery. He brings a mystery with him, but there's also like war films are often basically good guy versus bad guy, but often another plot can be like ragtag group of people who don't seem like they have anything in common come together to fight the big bad at the end of it. Okay, mood is an important one, but easy to overlook because it's not as concrete as the other things. But if you look at these two examples of Martians doing bad things to humanity, this is an updated War of the Worlds, and this is from the film Mars Attacks. Amazing movie. You can tell just by looking at these two things that they are going for vastly different moods. But they both have similar plots of aliens coming, potentially being, an unknown, and whether or not they're going to be a threat, we don't necessarily know. And there are spaceships in them, and they're on Earth. But obviously, the mood is way different. You can tell just because of what the aliens look like, the colors, etc., etc. Okay. Mayday. Iconography is not just a fun word to say, but basically what visuals are part of the genre. What would you feel like was missing if it weren't there? You know what I'm saying. What is part of the visual experience by seeing something? So, in some sort of outer spacey sci-fi thing, we would expect to see laser guns and spaceships and spacesuits and humanoids and a lot of blinking lights for computers that are telling us big bad things. Would we expect to see some sort of presidential seal and stuff like that? There's kind of a crossover between this and cinematic aspects that's coming next. But I don't want you to just think of like what objects get carried around, because there's more to our visual than just visual objects. It is really kind of the whole display visually that we're looking for. Then finally, cinematic style, cinematic aspects. This is our favorite thing about analyzing films now, of how does the editing look? What are they doing? Is there something characteristic with lighting? Is there something characteristic with camera angles, camera movement? How close is the camera? How intimate is the camera with people? What is the color grading? It's really interesting in Gravity that although it's taking place in space and out of space, and there are a lot of real close-up right in people's faces, but somehow the overall color still is muted, that there's not much rich color in Gravity itself, and it's almost it's really interesting, the close-ups that you end up with Jessica Chastain are like she's kind of the most alive person there, and obviously she has red hair anyway, but it is interesting that she's also imbued with sort of more of the color than we see oftentimes. um, Over here in my scrawled handwriting, you wouldn't necessarily see a horror film that didn't have any shadows. You know, usually they're very much low-key lighting. They often use long takes to build up suspense. It's real scary, etc., etc. Um, these little things right here, those are the elements that you're looking for of like, how are you finding a pattern in cinematic style? So hopefully this walks you through a little bit of these elements, that when you see similarities in these elements, you're able to, prove that you have found or defined or are looking at a particular genre. BT dubs, no movie is going to totally match up with another movie in each one of these areas. So I don't want you to either start lying about whether or not a movie kind of has something in that. I don't mean lying, but trying to make one thing fit into the pattern. It's totally fine. Like the differences, there are going to be differences between different movies within a genre or a subgenre, just because otherwise it'd be super boring. We wouldn't watch the movie again. Okay, that's about it. All my best. Goodbye.